Conspicuously evident in Valencian notarial records beginning in the late fall of 1489 are the sales of enslaved Canary Islanders, overwhelmingly women and girls. On November 18th, 1489, a Valencian merchant sold a 30-year-old white captive named Catarina, seized from the Canaries in conjunction with her 7-year-old daughter, Johaneta. Likewise, on February 10th, 1490, a Valencian merchant sold 2 white female captives, de Canaria, 13-year-old Isabel and 9-year-old Catarina. It bears emphasis that in both of these cases, the seller expressed no doubts about these girls' lawfully enslaved status, assuring the buyer that they were de bona guerra, that is, legitimately captured and sold into slavery. Enslaved Canary Islanders, of course, were hardly novelties in 15th century Iberia. Scholars have documented their presence in Castile and Portugal from at least the late 14th century, and in Majorca from at least the 1340s. In these early days of European expansion into the Middle Atlantic, Iberian slavers likened Canary Islanders to their much more established non-Christian enemies, the Moros. In 1391, for instance, a Catalan slaver fixed the location of the islands where he captured a certain 5-year-old girl as, quote, just opposite the shores of Guinea, in the land of Saracens. Over the course of the 15th century, however, as Christian missionizing efforts won over a reputedly substantial number of new converts, and as individual islands were conquered and were subjugated to Castilian rule, the Canary Islands' status as legitimate slaving zone was increasingly in dispute. In the 1430s, for instance, Pope Eugenius IV issued multiple bulls criminalizing the seizure of his Canary Island vassals, protesting loudly that unlawful slaving threatened to torpedo the entire missionizing project. Likewise, in 1477, the Bishop of Canarias, Juan de Frias, decried the actions of Portuguese slavers who had seized members of his flock. Noting how he personally had administered Christian sacraments to these Canary Islanders and observed how they faithfully paid their tithes, this bishop stridently insisted upon these Canary Islanders' protected status as verdaderos cristianos. Amid these strongly worded rebukes from bishops and popes, however, slaving continued apace. Portuguese, Castilian, and Catalan raiders seem to have generally disregarded claims that Canary Islanders were off limits to slavers. And yet, certain incidents were deemed beyond the pale. And here I'm referring to an incident that took place in November of 1488 on the island of La Gomera, the mass enslavement of the island's entire population of women and children. Oops, I skipped a bunch of slides. Okay. In November 1488, Hernan Raza, the much reviled Castilian lord of the island of La Gomera, one of the 7 principal islands that make up the Canary Island archipelago, was assassinated by a band of indigenous rebels. The event sparked an island-wide revolt that was, in 1489, brutally suppressed by the combined forces of Beatriz de Bobadilla, who was Hernan Raza's widow, and Pedro de Vera, the Castilian governor of the neighboring island of Gran Canaria. De Vera had been summoned to rescue the beleaguered widow after she became trapped in a tower with her 2 young children, surrounded by rebel forces who vastly outnumbered her own. After the dust settled and their power restored, Beatriz and Pedro, in vengeance, ordered the rounding up of the island's entire female population, along with all children under the age of 15. Loaded onto caravels, they were then shipped off to be sold into slavery in Castile and beyond. The quote on the bottom of the slide is taken from the royal provision issued in 1490, condemning this deed. The mass enslavement, not surprisingly, immediately provoked vigorous protests from the Bishop of Canarias at the time, Miguel López de la Serna, leading to the issuance of the aforementioned 1490 Crown Directive, pronouncing the mass enslavement unlawful and empowering this bishop to pursue justice for all those gomeras y gomeros unlawfully enslaved. And here again on the slide, I've highlighted, I've highlighted the relevant passage from this 1490 Royal Directive declaring the mass enslavement unlawful on the grounds that these were innocent Christians who ought not to be held responsible for their husbands' or fathers' crimes. The scandal produced by the mass enslavement of these innocent and nominally Christianized women and children set in motion an extraordinary chain of events. A massive trans-regional redemptionist effort coordinated by royal and ecclesiastical officials. In a series of articles published in the 1930s, each with hefty documentary appendices, very grateful for those appendices, the German historian Dominic Wolfel painstakingly pieces together the history of these gomeras, unlawfully enslaved in the wake of the 1488-89 rebellion. In tracing these redemptionist networks, Wolfel did some considerable detective work, following the paper trail documenting the payment of reparations, payments notably that were made not to the enslaved gomeras themselves, but to their purportedly duped buyers to compensate them for the financial losses they incurred by complying with this royal order to liberate them. Where did all this reparation money come from? In the aforementioned crown order, Ferdinand and Isabella not only ordered that all unlawfully enslaved gomeras should be freed, but also ordered that a fine of 500,000 maravedis apiece be exacted from the perpetrators of the crime, from both Beatriz de Bobadilla and Pedro de Vera. So this combined sum of 1 million maravedis was deposited into a general fund used to dole out reparations. And so Wolfel uncovered receipts of these payments dating from 1490 to 1502, made to some 99 owners of freed gomeros. It also bears emphasis that the women and young children liberated through the efforts of the bishops of Canarias and Malaga in Castile, these women and children were not repatriated or reunited with their natal families. Rather, they were transferred into the custody of good Christians, into households where they would receive further instruction in the Holy Christian faith and serve as salaried household domestics. Judging from the multiple complaints filed by these liberated gomeras protesting abuse and mistreatment, it seems that these gomera women and children that the bishops of Canarias and Malaga freed in the 1490s simply traded one form of servitude for another in Castile. In 1498, for example, Margarida, a freed gomera living in the town of Loja, protested that in the 8 years since she had been liberated, her protector treated her like a slave and refused to pay her any salary. In 1500, Francisca, a Canaria gomera living in Jerez de la Frontera, likewise protested that the only recompense she had received for the past 10 years of service was, quote, a whole lot of aggravation and harm. And here let me note that I find very striking the parallels between the experiences of these Gomeran children enslaved in the aftermath of the 1488-89 rebellion and the experiences of Morisco children enslaved in the course of the revolt of the Moriscos between 1568 and 1570, whose plight has been so poignantly chronicled by Stephanie Kavanaugh. And Kavanaugh underlines how Philip II's decree freeing captured Morisco children required them to remain in the custody of their former masters in the capacity of servants until they reached the age of majority, where they would be raised and educated by their former masters. So we see in both instances, a royal decree liberating children from the bonds of slavery seems part and parcel of a strategy to survey and control them, an act motivated less by piety or charity and more by politics. The few scholars who have treated these events have viewed them strictly through the lens of how they illustrate Europeans' evolving views of Canary Islanders. Dominic Wolfel, for instance, emphasizes how this incident provoked much soul searching among Spanish ecclesiastics and crown officials, as well as real and meaningful action. And he's very much concerned to get with pushing back against the Black legend. That's really the motivator here. Helen later argued that incidents like these pricked the consciences of merchants who were increasingly plagued by doubts about the legality of Christians enslaving Christians. These incidents contributed to the emergence of a new consensus based on mounting evidence that Canary Islanders were demonstrably assimilatable into Christian society. This mounting evidence leading to this new consensus that Atlantic peoples should be treated differently. Thus, Nader asserts by 1500, quote, the Spanish monarchs could no longer perceive conquered Atlantic people in the same way they regarded conquered Muslims. And I don't really want to belabor the point, but this is also a point really stressed in the really fantastic work in this vein, also produced by Emily Berquist-Soule. My interest in this incident today, however, is considerably less lofty. Today, my aim simply is to lay out some intriguing bits of evidence, illuminating the individual trajectories of those unlawfully enslaved Gomeras who wound up in Valencia. In doing so, I aim to shift our attention, at least momentarily, away from this debate about how Europeans viewed Canary Islanders to instead explore how Canary Islanders navigated this new landscape. The documents I've uncovered so far are significant in that they illuminate what previously had been somewhat of a black hole. Although Wolfe acknowledges that many of these unlawfully enslaved Gomeras were likewise exported into the territories of the Crown of Aragon, the paper trail he was chasing did not extend into the territories of the Crown of Aragon. Though Vicenta Cortez, in her exhaustive article exploring the Valencian trade in enslaved Canary Islanders, does reference this instance, even noting how the Bailiff General of Valencia had been informed of the 1490 Crown Directive ordering these Gomeras' immediate liberation. She expresses extreme skepticism that anything like what occurred in Castile occurred in Valencia. In her estimate, these wrongfully enslaved Gomeras lacked both an advocate and the resources to do anything about this. Hence, both Wolfe and Cortez assume that the Gomerans who were shipped off to Valencia languished in captivity. In the course of doing archival research for my first book, however, I uncovered a modest but mighty, I will argue, modest but mighty, cache of documents that belie these assumptions. Indeed, they offer us some valuable new insights with respect to the sorts of strategies enslaved Canary Islanders living in the territories of the Crown of Aragon employed to rebuild their lives. The meatiest among these documents are 3 freedom suits filed before the court of the governor in the early 16th century, in 1500 and 1506, as well as a 4th petition filed before the court of the governor in 1507, in which an enslaved Canary Islander denied her involvement in a freedom suit in which she mistakenly, fraudulently, had been named as a co-plaintiff. More on this in a second. The main takeaway or discovery here, if I'm just going to try to get to the chase here, is what I see here is extensive community organizing going on. What's really striking about these freedom suits is their collective nature, how they really, they strikingly are acting collectively when engaging the machinery of the law to secure the liberation of themselves as well as their kin and compatriots. So let me shift now to kind of consider this paper trail in Valencia. While the total number of Gomeras shipped off to Valencia to be sold was hard to pin down, there's unfortunately a notable gap in the libros de confesiones, the cautivos that Abigail was discussing before. There's a gap between 1419 and 1494, so there's a black hole in terms of this period I'm interested in, which is 1489, 1490. But thankfully, we can turn to the records documenting the payment of the quinto, the payment of the customs duties on the slave sales happening in the port of Valencia. And although I haven't really had a chance to track down these records and consider them myself, Vicenta Cortez has a really extensive, sort of quantitative study of this. And her study lists 17 receipts of payments of the quinto owed on slave sales occurring during the period 1489, 1490, for a sum total of 46. enslaved Canary Islanders. And I'm going to assume that most of them probably came from La Gomera. 37 of these 46 were female, and 19 of the 46 were children whose ages most often are guesstimated as being between 10 and 12 years of age, though some were much younger, some as young as 4 years old. Judging from the notarial records that I cited at the beginning of my presentation, despite the fact that this royal provision existed in 1490, declaring the mass enslavement unlawful, if we kind of look at these notarial records that are continuing to be drawn up, recording the sale and resale of these Gomera women and children, buyers and sellers continue to express no doubts about their de bona guerra status. They're still, not really sweating it. While technically the royal provision empowering the bishops of Malaga and the Canary to work jointly towards securing the liberation of the wives, young women, boys, and girls who had unlawfully been captured and sold as slaves, technically extended their reach into the territories of the Crown of Aragon, I have yet to come across any evidence dating from the 1490s, at least, indicating any representative of these bishops traveling to Valencia to pursue justice on behalf of these wrongfully enslaved women and children. In other words, there is no parallel paper trail of reparations payments doled out to the dozens of duped buyers in Valencia. Rather, it would seem that Cortes is partly right, that the Gomeras in Valencia initially do seem to have languished in captivity. However, some 10 years later, on December 3rd, 1500, a compatriot of these enslaved Gomeras, somewhat miraculously, appeared in Valencia, bearing a crown directive signed personally by the Lord King and with his seal. His name was Bartolome Hernando. He's described as a native of La Gomera, and he somewhat single-handedly seems to have resurrected this 1490 royal provision. On the 27th of October, 1500, he secured an audience with King Fernando, wherein he convinced the king to empower him to pursue justice for his countrymen. And having been issued a safe conduct, placing him under royal protection during his travels throughout the territories of the Crown of Aragon, Bartolomeo set to work, publicizing this 1490 royal provision concerning the enslaved Canary Islanders from La Gomera. And while for Vicente Cortez, at this point, her trail kind of goes completely cold, she references this record, kind of reporting the delivery of this record of this crown provision to the hands of the Bailiff General of Valencia. She doesn't really find anything further, and so she sort of asserts, there's no further evidence of this, so we can't really know what became of it, and she kind of assumes it's just a failure. However, I stumbled on records revealing that Bartolomeo's mission did meet with considerable success. He's actually mentioned in connection with the liberation of several dozen Gomerans living not only in Valencia, but also in Majorca, all described as being enslaved in reprisal for the revolt of 1488 and 1489. And what's also notable is that he's not only freeing those that were directly enslaved, in that moment, but their descendants as well. So on the island of Majorca, he reportedly organized a collective of 32 natives of the island of La Gomera, 18 men and 14 women, who in 1502 jointly filed a demanda de libertad, and their names are all listed along with the names of their current owners in a court order, dictating that for the entire duration while this collective demanda de libertad was being adjudicated, quote, no one should dare transport, hide, mistreat, or otherwise impede them from pursuing justice. And what's also interesting is that although some of these co-plaintiffs reside in the same household, there are kind of two mother-daughter co-plaintiffs. There's one apparent couple, there's a pair of men, there's a trio of 2 women and a man. What's notable is that most of these co-plaintiffs are listed singly, which suggests that tracking them down and recruiting them to participate in this collective lawsuit had required a considerable amount of effort on Bartolomeo's part. The 3 freedom suits filed before the court of the governor in Valencia give us additional precious details about how exactly he went about doing his work, his kind of community organizing playbook. In testimony collected in support of a freedom suit filed individually by a Canary Islander named Eleanor in 1506, three women who described themselves as freed slaves, de la Isla de La Gomera, recounted how about 5 years ago, a fellow native of La Gomera named Bartomeu Hernando came to Valencia with the proclaimed mission of, quote, vindicating the free status of his fellow Gomerans. Bartomeu first broadly publicized the 1490 royal provision, and then tracked down and met individually with enslaved Canary Islanders whom he knew or suspected were originally from La Gomera, to encourage their participation in this collective petition demanding their immediate liberation. And you can compare this account with the testimony offered in connection with a roughly contemporary collective lawsuit mobilized by yet another group of Canary Islanders, rabble rousers. We see them kind of employing the same tactics. So this group of enslaved Canary Islanders that are mounting this collective lawsuit are coming from La Palma. And it's the description of how the collective lawsuit was put together is very similar. We have one woman sort of testifying how she was propositioned by some Canary Islanders and some fellow natives from La Palma who, quote, speaking to her, said to her, quote, why don't you demand your freedom with us? And in this case, this is the one where she's renouncing her participation in this. She insists that she had demurred, testifying that while she had told them she would think about it, she never spoke about this event ever again to anyone. So it's clear that, she demurred for whatever personal reasons she had for not wanting to, rock the boat, so to speak. It's clear that many others were more enthusiastic and signed on. And so this demanded labor tax that's being formed among these groups of slaves from La Palma had an impressive list of some 30 co-plaintiffs, 12 men and 17 to 18 women. And somewhat mysteriously, and I haven't really been able to figure out why, the names of all the female plaintiffs subsequently are dropped. We then have a record in the transcript filed by the Procurador del Miserable, sort of saying that he's dropping all 17 to 18 women, and he doesn't care to explain why. So I'm kind of intrigued by that, but I don't really know why yet. Okay, so returning back to the figure of Bartomeu Hernando. The extreme notoriety of his rabble rousing in 1500 became a sticking point when Eleanor pursued her own individual claim for freedom in 1506. In an effort to cast doubt on the veracity of Eleanor's claim that she was entitled to an automatic manumission on the grounds that she was a native of La Gomera, the defense raised pointed questions as to why Eleanor hadn't made common cause with her fellow Gomerans 5 years earlier. If Eleanor truly had been among those innocent Christians rounded up and enslaved by La Gente de la Bobadilla, why hadn't she signed on to this collective lawsuit spearheaded by Bartomeu Hernando? The municipally employed Procurador del Miserable explained that Eleanor's owner had maliciously concealed this valuable information from her, insisting that up until about a month ago, Eleanor had remained completely in the dark. But what's interesting is that the nobleman's defense attorney found this to be highly implausible. He asserted, quote, I do not believe that the said Eleanor had no notice of the said Crown ruling up until now. I believe rather that she would certainly have heard about this ruling immediately after it had been issued. This ruling was a highly notorious and broadly publicized thing in both the city and kingdom of Valencia in 1500. Consequently, if the said Eleanor had been one of those from the island of La Gomera, she would have demanded her freedom just like all the others had. But since the truth of the matter is that she was not, she did not demand her freedom. So despite this expression of extreme skepticism concerning the plausibility of Eleanor's claim that she too had been among those Gomeras unjustly rounded up and enslaved back in 1490, the governor nonetheless issued a ruling in her favor. One wonders, however, whether this might have been some extra legal maneuvering in connection with an amendment that Eleanor had added to her original petition, which possibly was a tactic to pressure this nobleman's family to back off and stop obstructing Eleanor's claim to freedom. In this amendment, Eleanor had asserted that she was also entitled to freedom on the grounds that she had borne her master 3 sons. two of whom were still living and currently living in this nobleman's household. Indeed, it's certainly striking that when the governor ultimately did issue this ruling in Eleanor's favor, awarding her freedom, he carefully specified that he was doing so solely on the basis of the proofs offered of her Gomeran identity. The governor underlined how it had not been proven that this nobleman was the father of Eleanor's three sons. And I'm bringing all the other details here because my basic interest here is to just show you the richness of these sources and how we really need to kind of integrate the experiences of Canary Islanders into our discussion of the experiences of the enslaved in the Mediterranean at this moment, because I think it has been overlooked. So while the demand of libertad filed by captured Moros and enslaved Tatars, Circassians, and Negras that I examined in my first book were generally one-off affairs involving at most two plaintiffs, mother-daughter complaintiffs, two sisters I encountered on one occasion. Armed with this 1490 royal directive, Canary Islanders, early in the 16th century, adopted a much more ambitious litigation strategy, the filing of collective freedom suits. It's in the context of mounting concerns that slaving was imperiling the missionizing project that we see Canary Islanders exploit strategies originally designed to facilitate the work of Christian bishops in transforming the wives and children of Canary Island rebels into their proper Christian vassals, towards empowering Canary Islanders to act collectively to recover their freedom. In stark contrast to what we saw in 1490s Andalusia, there's no indication here in 16th century Majorca or in 16th century Valencia that any special restrictions were imposed on these free Canary Islanders with respect to where they could live or work. Okay. We've seen how Bartolomeo Hernando's community organizing tactics on behalf of Gomeras would be embraced and emulated by other Canary Islander ethnic subgroups. That is, this other case I brought up involving the several dozen Canary Islanders from La Palma that roughly at the same time launched their own collective lawsuit. And so, I think this is part of our general pattern that we see kind of, again, other Canary Islanders ethnic subgroups, other Christianized communities from the Canary Islands, such as La Palma, likewise kind of latching on to these tactics. So we see evidence of this, particularly on the island of Majorca. I've uncovered references to at least two additional collective lawsuits filed in 1512 by an enslaved group of natives of both La Gomera and Gran Canaria. And in 1515, a really interesting one involving a group of Gomeros who lived in really rural regions in Majorca, that then kind of congregate in the villages of Porreras and Campos. 5 minutes. Okay. I'm already over time. So my conclusion, let me just say this. My intent in this paper is hardly to claim that Canary Islanders were better off than their contemporaries in captivity or to exaggerate their legal savvy. Rather, it is an invitation to consider how the actions, choices, and strategies of both individuals and collectivities of enslaved Canary Islanders reflect the distinct challenges and possibilities they encountered in navigating their new landscape. Though I've been highlighting collective action amongst Canary Islanders, the fact that so much of my discussion centered on the distinctive status of Gomeras exposes the inevitability of treating Canary Islanders as a monolith. Again, my aim here most simply is to call attention to these rich archival materials that enable us and really demand that we write a more textured history of their peninsular experiences. Thank you.